All right, so get ready for a deep dive. This one is going to be um, fascinating and a little unsettling, to be honest. We're going to be looking at this trend, popping up at these conservative events lately. It's these gestures that look a lot like, well, Nazi salutes.
Yeah, it's pretty striking.
And what's even weirder, even some actual neo-Nazi figures are finding it all like a bit too much, you know what I mean?
Yeah, I saw that.
It's wild. So we've got articles from like The Independent Time, AJC Germany, even like an academic journal about atonement policies, the whole thing. So buckle up. We're about to go deep on this one.
Yeah, we're really going to unpack a lot here. I mean, you've got figures like Steve Bannon,
Right.
Trump's former strategist, and even Elon Musk doing these gestures. It really makes you think about, like, what's going on here? This blurring of the lines between, like, what was once considered fringe extremism and the more mainstream conservative movement.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. Okay, let's start with like the actual salutes, right? Like
Mhm.
The Independent reported that Bannon, he seemingly gave one at CPAC.
CPAC, right.
Yeah, the Conservative Political Action Conference. And this was after a speech where he's like, urging Trump to run for a third term.
Oh, wow.
He's yelling, fight, fight, fight. And then boom, up goes the arm.
It's hard to miss the visual there, right?
Right.
And then there's Musk. At Trump's inauguration event, he raises his arm, says, my heart goes out to you. I mean, whether these were like intentional Nazi salutes or not, I don't know. It's debatable. But I mean, the point is they're happening.
Yeah.
They're causing a stir, especially in Europe, I mean,
Yeah.
where that gesture, it carries a lot more historical baggage, you can say.
Yeah, you're not kidding. The Guardian, they had a piece on how people over in Europe reacted to Musk's gesture, and they weren't too happy about it, let's just say.
Yeah, I can imagine.
Especially in Germany, right? I mean, they've worked so hard to confront their Nazi past.
Oh, absolutely. Germany has really gone above and beyond to grapple with their history. I mean, legally, educationally, you name it. There's even this whole debate going on right now about renaming streets that are named after, figures with anti-Semitic connections. The AJC Germany article talks about that. So yeah, in that context, these gestures, intentional or not, they hit different.
Yeah, and then you've got like this added layer of irony where some actual neo-Nazi figures are finding this whole thing uncomfortable.
It's wild.
Like The Independent, they quoted Nick Fuentes, right?
Yeah.
He's a prominent white nationalist figure, and he's saying that it's getting a little too real for him.
Too real?
Almost like they're encroaching on his territory.
It's bizarre, but Fuentes' discomfort. I mean, even if it's self-serving to some extent, it does point to a larger trend, and it's a little unnerving, to be honest.
Yeah.
The more these symbols are used, in these mainstream settings, the less shocking they become. It's like it's this dangerous game of desensitization.
Right.
And it could have real consequences down the line.
It makes me think about, that question, that age-old question, like if a tree falls in the woods and no one's around to hear it, does it make a sound? Like in this case, if a Nazi salute happens at a mainstream event and no one like bats an eye, does it still carry the same weight?
That's a great analogy.
Yeah.
Because the danger here is that, these symbols, they lose their power to shock. And that allows the ideologies they represent to seep into the mainstream, more easily.
Right.
It's insidious.
Yeah. Yeah. Speaking of mainstreaming, like potentially dangerous ideologies, let's talk about Germany, right? And the rise of the AfD, the Alternative for Germany Party, Time. They had this exclusive interview with Alice Weidel. She's the AfD leader. And it's clear that they're like tapping into a lot of the same resentments, and nationalistic sentiments that we're seeing, elsewhere.
And what's fascinating here is that you have these figures like, again, Elon Musk, actively promoting the AfD. I mean, he tweeted, only the AfD can save Germany. And he even published an op-ed like for a German newspaper praising them.
Hold on. Elon Musk wrote an op-ed for a German newspaper.
He did.
Wow. That's dedication. But seriously, what's behind this like sudden interest in German politics?
Well, he didn't stop at the op-ed. He also appeared via video, like at an AfD rally, urging them to like move beyond past guilt. It seems to tie into this broader point he's making about free speech, and democracy, and specifically criticizing this thing called the firewall in German politics.
The firewall, what's that? I'm not familiar with that term.
So basically, it's this unspoken rule in German politics, where mainstream parties, they just refuse to work with far-right parties like the AfD. It's a way of, like, shutting them out of power and protecting German democracy from, extremist influence.
So Musk is arguing that this firewall is actually anti-democratic.
He's framing it as an issue of free speech, saying that, like, all voices deserve to be heard no matter how extreme their views are, which of course ignores the very real dangers of, legitimizing a party with the AfD's, history.
It's almost like when, social media platforms, they ban hate speech, right?
Yeah.
And people cry censorship. But isn't there a difference between like free speech and, inciting violence or promoting dangerous ideologies? Like where do we draw the line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that's become increasingly, like, urgent as the lines between, extremist views and mainstream politics just continue to blur.
Right. And it's not just Musk, right, wading into these murky waters. Time also reported on Vice President J.D. Vance. He met with Vital and actually like defended the AfD,
Oh, wow.
said that, ostracizing them is the most surefire way to destroy democracy.
That's really concerning.
Right.
Because it suggests a willingness to, like, engage with and potentially, legitimize a party that espouses these xenophobic and nationalistic views.
Yeah.
It's a trend that's worth paying close attention to, for sure, both here in the U.S. and abroad.
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting because, while the AfD is gaining traction in Germany, there's also this whole other conversation happening about how Germany, deals with its past. And it's more nuanced than just saying Germany's good now because they apologized.
Right. It's not that simple. In fact, Pankaj Mishra, he writes for the London Review of Books. He argues that Germany's what he calls strategic philosemitism has actually served to, like, whitewash their own past while shifting blame onto others.
Okay, hold on. Strategic philosemitism. What does that even mean?
So essentially what he's saying is that, Germany's strong support for Israel, while potentially genuine, in part, is also being used as a way to, like, deflect criticism and present themselves as, like, morally redeemed.
So it's like they're saying, look how much we love Israel. We can't possibly be anti-Semitic. Meanwhile, they're turning a blind eye to other forms of prejudice.
That's one way to look at it. Mishra also points out how this has led to, like, a demonization of Muslims in Germany, framing them as, like, the new anti-Semites, even though, the data suggests that most anti-Semitic crimes are actually committed by, right-wing white Germans.
Wow, that's quite a claim. And it kind of echoes what we were talking about earlier with, Fuentes and the neo-Nazis feeling like uncomfortable. It's like, who are the real extremists here?
Right. It really highlights how historical memory can be manipulated for political purposes.
Yeah.
It's not just about acknowledging the past, It's about understanding its complexities and how those lessons, like, apply to the present. And that's a conversation that's happening in Germany, but it's also relevant to us here in the U.S.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, so we've got this unsettling normalization of, like, Nazi-like gestures. We've got this shifting political landscape in Germany with the AfD and this whole question of, like, how do we grapple with history in a meaningful way? Like, where do we go from here?
Well, there's this fascinating research on atonement as like a political strategy by Catherine Bachleitner. It's in this journal called Lawfare. She uses the 1952 Luxembourg Agreement between West Germany and Israel as, like, a case study, highlighting how it successfully blended a formal apology with substantial reparations.
Reparations, huh? That's always a tricky subject, but it sounds like this particular agreement was actually, like, pretty effective. What made it work?
It was unique in its combination of, a sincere apology and real tangible compensation. Leitner argues that this approach, it offers a potential model for other nations grappling with their own, dark chapters.
So are you saying there's hope?
Yeah.
That maybe we can actually learn from the past and move towards, like, genuine reconciliation?
It's definitely not a simple solution, and there's a lot of, complexity involved. But the Luxembourg Agreement shows that atonement, while challenging, it's not impossible. It takes a willingness to confront difficult truth, to accept responsibility and to make amends,
Yeah. It makes me wonder if this kind of model could be applied to like other situations, like the legacy of slavery in the U.S. or the treatment of indigenous peoples.
That's an excellent question, and one that deserves a whole deep dive of its own, honestly. The nuances of each situation are unique, of course,
Yeah.
but those core principles,
Yeah.
acknowledgement, apology, and reparation, they could potentially be applied in various contexts.
Yeah, it raises the question of whether like true forgiveness is even possible,
Hmm.
especially when you're dealing with like atrocities on such a massive scale.
Yeah. Forgiveness is a deeply personal journey, and there's no right or wrong answer there, but atonement as a political strategy, it can help create an environment where healing and dialogue are possible, even if complete forgiveness, remains elusive.
Mm. So as we wrap up part one of this deep dive, what are some like key takeaways for our listeners to ponder?
Well, I think the big questions to consider are, what does all of this say about our current moment? Are we seeing a dangerous shift toward extremism,
Mm.
or is this a necessary reckoning with uncomfortable truths? And ultimately, how do we ensure history doesn't repeat itself?
And perhaps even more importantly, like what role do each of us play in shaping the future? We'll dive deeper into these questions and more when we come back for part two of this deep dive.
Yeah, it's a heavy question, and it's something that Germany is like actively grappling with, as we saw in that AGC Germany article. They're debating whether to like rename streets honoring figures with anti-Semitic connections, like Richard Wagner, the composer.
Wagner, the Rite of the Valkyries guy, he was anti-Semitic.
Oh yeah, yeah. He wrote this whole essay called Judaism and Music. It's full of like anti-Semitic tropes.
Wow. So even like seemingly high culture stuff can be tainted by these ideologies.
Absolutely. And that's why these, discussions about renaming streets and confronting the legacies of these historical figures, they're so important. They force us to like re-examine our assumptions and grapple with the complexities of history.
Yeah, yeah. It's like holding a mirror up to society and realizing that the reflection is a lot more complicated than we thought.
Precisely. And sometimes that reflection, it reveals these unsettling truths that we might prefer to just ignore.
Right, right. Speaking of unsettling truths,
Yeah.
let's circle back to those salutes for a moment. We talk about Bannon and Musk, but the Independent also mentioned that Sound of Freedom producer Eduardo Verastegui, he did one at CPAC as well,
Mhm.
and apparently there have been like other copycat incidents at right wing events.
It seems like it's becoming a trend, which is incredibly worrying. It normalizes these symbols and desensitizes people to their historical significance. There's a real danger that these gestures become so commonplace that they lose their shock value, and people just stop seeing them as problematic.
And then you have people like Matt Schlapp, the CPAC chairman. According to AP News, he defends Bannon by saying that, Bannon supported resolutions against anti-Semitism. It's like they're trying to have it both ways.
It does seem like a classic case of cognitive dissonance. They want to embrace these gestures and these figures associated with white nationalism, but they also want to distance themselves from the label of anti-Semitism.
Yeah.
It's a dangerous game they're playing.
Yeah. And a confusing one for those of us trying to like make sense of it all.
Indeed. And it's not just happening in the U.S., right? As we discussed, Germany is facing its own challenges with the rise of the AfD and the normalization of extremist views.
Right, right. And this is where the issue of historical memory gets like really complicated because Germany has done so much to confront its Nazi past, but it seems like there are still these undercurrents of resentment and a desire to like rewrite history.
Yeah. Pankaj Mishra, he makes a really powerful argument about this in his article for the London Review of Books.
Mhm.
He talks about Germany's what he calls subcontracting of guilt.
Some contracting of guilt. Okay, that's a new one for me. What does he mean by that?
So Mishra argues that Germany has, in a sense, like outsourced its guilt for the Holocaust by focusing so intensely on supporting Israel and demonizing Muslims while downplaying the ongoing presence of anti-Semitism within German society itself.
So it's like they're saying we've atoned for our past by supporting Israel, therefore we can't be held responsible for any any new instances of anti-Semitism.
That's the gist of it, yeah. And it's a dangerous logic because it allows them to avoid, fully confronting the roots of prejudice and intolerance within their own
Yeah.
society.
It also feels deeply unfair to Muslims who are being like scapegoated and stereotyped as inherently anti-Semitic.
Absolutely. Ezra Uzurik's book, Subcontractors of Guilt, which were reviews, it delves deeper into this phenomenon, exploring how Muslims in Germany have become like targets of suspicion and discrimination, despite the fact that, as we mentioned, most anti-Semitic crimes in Germany are actually committed by right-wing white Germans.
It seems like a classic case of like projecting your own flaws onto others.
It is, and it distracts from the real work that needs to be done to address, the underlying issues of prejudice and extremism.
Okay, so we've got this complex web of historical memory, political opportunism, and the normalization of extremist symbols. It's all pretty overwhelming, to be honest. Is there any reason to be like hopeful here?
Well, as Catherine Bachleitner argues in her Lawfare article, atonement as a political strategy, it can be effective in promoting reconciliation and healing. She points to the 1952 Luxembourg Agreement between West Germany and Israel as a successful example of this.
But can that model really be applied to other situations, like the legacy of slavery in the U.S. or the treatment of indigenous peoples?
It's certainly not a one-size-fits-all solution. Each context is unique and presents its own challenges, but the core principles of acknowledgement, apology, and making amends, they're essential for any kind of meaningful reconciliation.
The idea of reparations is incredibly controversial, though.
It is, and there are valid concerns about how to implement such policies in a fair and equitable way. But the core principles of acknowledgement, apology, and making amends are essential for any kind of meaningful reconciliation.
Mm-hmm. All of this is giving me a lot to think about. What other avenues should we be exploring in this deep dive?
Well, we've talked a lot about the political and social implications of these neo-Nazi salutes, but there's another layer we haven't really touched on yet.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
The psychological layer.
Yeah.
Why are these symbols so powerful? What is it about the human psyche that makes them so compelling, even repellent to some?
That's a fascinating question. I'm ready to dive in.
All right, then. Let's explore the dark side of the human mind.
The dark side of the human mind, huh? That sounds pretty intense. I'm ready though. Let's hear it.
Well, think about it this way. These symbols, I mean, as repugnant as they are to many, they hold this strange power. They represent this dark chapter in history, but they also tap into something primal. Something that can be like both alluring and terrifying at the same time.
Yeah, it's like they're a forbidden fruit, right? The more taboo they are, the more people want to like explore them.
There's definitely an element to that for sure. But it goes deeper than just, curiosity. These symbols, they often represent power, belonging, a sense of identity, especially for people who feel, marginalized or disenfranchised.
So for someone who feels like they don't have a voice, these symbols offer a way to be seen, to be heard, even if it's in a negative way.
Exactly. And that's what makes them so dangerous. They offer this sense of community and purpose, but it's a false promise. It's built on hate and exclusion.
Yeah, it's like joining a gang almost. You get that sense of belonging, but at a terrible cost.
That's a really powerful analogy. And what we're seeing now is a sort of like psychological contagion effect. These symbols, they were once like relegated to the fringes, but now they're becoming increasingly visible in these mainstream settings. And this repetition, it creates a sense of normalcy. It makes it easier for people to adopt these behaviors, even if they wouldn't have considered them before,
It's almost like a feedback loop. The
Yeah.
more you see it, the less shocking it becomes, and the more likely you are to do it yourself, or at least to tolerate it in others.
Precisely. And this is especially true, I think, online,
Yeah.
where, algorithms can create these echo chambers that reinforce these views and behaviors. It's like a breeding ground for extremism.
So given all of that, how do we break the cycle? How do we counter the psychological appeal of these symbols?
Well, education and critical thinking are crucial, as we've discussed. We need to understand the history behind these symbols, the ideologies they represent, and the very real dangers that they pose.
Right. knowledge is power, as they say. But is that enough? I mean, these symbols, they also tap into these deep-seated emotions, right?
You're absolutely right. It's not just about like intellectual understanding. We also need to address the emotional appeal of these symbols. They often play on our fears and anxieties, fear of the other, fear of change, fear of, losing power or status.
And those fears, they can be so easily manipulated by those seeking to like sow division and gain power. It's a classic tactic. Yeah.
Yes, it is. So part of countering the appeal of these symbols is addressing those underlying, social and economic conditions that create these fears in the first place.
Right. You're talking about things like inequality, lack of opportunity, a sense of, being left behind, the things that make people feel like vulnerable and susceptible to these extreme ideologies.
Exactly. When people feel insecure or threatened, they're more likely to latch on to ideologies that offer, you know, simple solutions and scapegoats. It's a way of like making sense of a world that feels increasingly, chaotic and out of control.
So it's not just about like fighting hate. It's about building a more just and equitable society, where
Yeah.
everyone feels valued and secure. It's about addressing the root causes of these problems.
Yeah, that's a crucial part of the equation for sure. But it's also about fostering, resilience and critical thinking skills so that individuals are less vulnerable to manipulation and propaganda, regardless of their, socioeconomic background.
It's almost like we need to like build up our psychological immune systems, We need to be able to recognize and resist these harmful ideologies, no matter how seductive or appealing they may seem on the surface.
Exactly. And it's an ongoing process, right? We need to be vigilant to question our assumptions
Yeah.
and to challenge those around us when they espouse these hateful or dangerous ideas.
That reminds me of that article from Kontara.de about, racism in Germany. Even 20 years after the NSU neo-Nazi terror cell was uncovered, racist tendencies are still on the rise. It's a stark reminder that progress isn't always linear.
It's true. It's true. And it underscores the importance of continued vigilance and action. We can't afford to become complacent or to assume that these problems will just solve themselves.
Yeah. It can feel overwhelming at times, to be honest. But I also think it's important not to like give in to despair. We have to believe that change is possible.
I agree. Despair is a luxury we can't afford. We have to hold on to hope, but it can't be a passive hope. It has to be a hope that fuels action, that drives us to challenge injustice and to work towards a better future.
So what's our call to action for our listeners today? What can they do to make a difference?
I think the most important thing is to stay informed and engaged.
Hmm.
Don't let these issues fade into the background noise. Read critically, question your assumptions, and have those difficult conversations with friends and family, even when it's uncomfortable.
Yeah, yeah. Don't be afraid to call out hate and prejudice when you see it. Silence is complicity after all.
That's right. And
Yeah.
and support organizations that are working to fight hate and promote tolerance. Get involved in your community, volunteer your time. Speak up for those who are marginalized and voiceless.
It all comes down to action, really. Even small actions can have a ripple effect.
Absolutely. And remember, hope is not a passive emotion. It requires action, courage, and a willingness to fight for a better world.
Well said. On that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive. But as we've discovered, this conversation is far from over. This is just the beginning.
Indeed. The journey towards a more just and equitable world is ongoing. And it requires all of us to participate. So keep learning, keep questioning, and keep fighting for what you believe in.
Absolutely. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, stay curious, stay engaged, and stay hopeful.